Hello and welcome to the Exploring the Faith YouTube channel. My name is Cole DeSantis and I'm joined today by Charles Coulombe. Charles Coulombe, as many of you know, is a friend of the channel. I've interviewed him before. He's the scholar in residence at the Tumbler House, a traditional Catholic publication company. His interests are vast, ranging from literature, cultural criticism, philosophy, theology. And today he's joining me to discuss the topic of the social kingship of Christ and its relation to religious pluralism. So thank you so much, Charles. And I know we're going to have a great interview today.
Oh, thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I hope I've got something coherent to say. We'll find out.
Nah, you always do. You're definitely one of the great wordsmiths of, contemporary Catholicism. So, but in our last interview, we talked about the concept of the social kingship of Christ, and we discussed this concept sort of in its more broader doctrinal, sort of spiritual setting. But now I think I'd like to focus a little bit more on something specific, and this is where things get to be a little bit more controversial. So namely, how do Catholics accept the reality of the social kingship of Christ while also trying to find ways to navigate the reality of a religiously pluralistic world? And I guess the first place to start is by talking about what role does religion play in society? And this is something that a lot of people tend to overlook, but which is actually very important sociologically and morally. So what is the traditional Catholic view on the role, the nature of religion, the role of religion in society and culture, and how does that compare to some of the views in the sort of the secular realm on the nature and role of religion?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think the first thing we have to bear in mind is that there's perception, as in what pours out of the mouths and other orify of commentators and so on, and the reality of life as it has always been, always shall be. So, in other words, I might say, as a pundit, that gravity is a social construct. But no matter how much my mouth may yap that, I'm still going to fall out the Empire State Building if I try to go out the window, and I'll go splat. I may be screaming all the way down, this isn't happening, but trust me, at the end, I'm going to go splat.
Yeah.
The world may be better off, but I won't be. So, I mention this because every society has a state church. That is to say, an organizing principle that declares, an organizing philosophy that declares that it answers the great questions. Why am I here? What am I doing here? Why are we a group? What's the point? That basically tells the ruling classes how they ought to behave. How well they live up to that's another issue, of course, or down to it, as the case may be, depending on the particular religion. And mind you, I call this a state religion. It need not be "quote unquote" religious. Communism was the state religion of the Soviet bloc, and its dogma, you might say, was there is no God and Lenin is his prophet. But nevertheless, Marxism-Leninism was the state church of the Soviet bloc, and to a degree remains so of China, Cuba, even its weird local Shia variant in North Korea, and in Vietnam and Laos. Now, that state faith is what gives legitimacy to the authority under which those in charge exercise power. And that is true of every society that's ever been. So just as the question is never, are we going to have a ruling class? Because you're going to, trust me.
Yeah.
The question is, what is the nature of the ruling class? Similarly, it's not, are we going to have a state religion? No, we have one.
Yeah.
Now, my church may be separated from the state, sure.
Yeah.
But I assure you, the state is animated by a faith of some kind. And that faith, whatever the system, whatever the setup, will punish heretics. If you don't believe me, deny the Holocaust in Europe. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the Holocaust shouldn't happen. I know it did. I had enough relatives who died in it.
Yeah.
But that's not my point. My point is, if you deny the Holocaust in Europe, you're a criminal. It is a heresy that will be punished by the state church. And you see, we have to, before we can discuss anything, we have to establish a few realities. Toleration only extends to whatever the ruling classes aren't interested in and don't care about. Kind of like with normal people. You know, in anything you don't care about, you're very, very open and accepting.
Yeah.
If you think it's important, then suddenly, watch your tolerance go flying out the window.
Yeah.
Now, you may say you're against censorship, or you're for it. You say you're against it, you're lying, because there are ideas, there are thoughts you don't think should be said. Even if it's just me going into a movie theater and shouting fire.
Yeah.
You're still censoring my right to free speech. You believe in limits to freedom of speech, and everybody does. And part of our problem today is that we pretend we don't. Well, yes, we do. So part of really understanding reality is figuring out just what it is, what we do accept and what we don't accept. And I have to descend to the infantile.
Yeah.
Because that's where we are today, the infantile. When you have spent decades pretending that these things are not so, then, I mean, look what's going on all over Europe right now. The Sir Keir Starmer, or Stormtrooper as his buddies call him, in England, is all for censorship and makes no bones about it. You will be punished for expressing the wrong views. So let's make that understood. Depending amongst other things, the state church decides what is heresy. And then, of course, the state determines how heresy should be punished. Now, that's always going to be the case. You may not have the social kingship of Christ, but you'll have the social kingship of somebody.
Yeah.
Or in the immortal words of that great theologian, Bob Dylan, you got to serve somebody.
Absolutely. And I feel like that's common sense, but a lot of like they say, common sense is not so common, you know?
It's not common, and to steal from George Orwell, when a society is based upon lies, telling the truth becomes a subversive act.
Exactly. You know?
That's where we are. And I have to say all of this stuff prior to saying anything about the social kingship of Christ, because before you could look at it and get your hackles up and say, oh, I couldn't accept that, first look at what it is you do accept. You see, it's kind of like when people say, I can't accept papal infallibility. Well, yeah, but that's only because it's papal. There is infallibility you do accept. Let's find out what that infallibility you accept is. And then perhaps I can illustrate papal infallibility to you.
Yeah.
So similarly, sorry?
No, you were saying?
So having said all of that, it is not then a question of will there be a social kingship? There is, and always will be, because there always will be a state church. The question is, whose shall it be?
Yeah. And I guess that's the question, is there has to be a principle of social cohesion, right? And the ultimate basis of social cohesion is the values or ideas that we accept that structure society. And do you want social values, rooted in the truth? Or do you want ones rooted in lies? And so I guess so now that we know why we need to accept the concept of the social kingship of Christ, I guess this now leads to the question of what is the social kingship of Christ? And in our last discussion, you actually spelled it out, with quite detail, with a lot of detail, And I'll actually include a link to our previous video in the show notes on the in the description. But if you can just maybe describe the concept sort of in brief and how this concept came about, I think that would actually, for those who are where this is the first time looking at our discussions, I think that would probably help them out a lot. You know.
All right. Well, I guess the best way to illustrate it is to take an historical peek. And for that, we have to go back to the Last Supper, believe it or not. Now, the Last Supper was an exciting evening. A lot of things took place. Christ started the priesthood. He started the sacraments, particularly he began the Eucharist, which was completed, you might say, with his. It was started with the Last Supper and completed with the sacrifice, his death on the cross. But he did something else. He united the Davidic kingship, to which he was the rightful heir, humanly speaking, with the communio of the church. And so the church became a body, a thing, a kingdom, if you will. Now, the great image of that was the washing of the feet. And there, in ages to come, in the Middle Ages, Maundy Thursday's foot washing became a very special preserve of kings and emperors and princes, because they saw Christian kingship as a participation in the kingship of Christ. And so this became a very big deal for them. Well, in the first couple of centuries after the church began, these things, you might say, were interesting, but they weren't all important, because the state was certainly not Catholic wherever the church was. And basically the only thing that Catholics, the relationship of Catholics with the heathen state, was to pay its taxes, to die in its wars, and to occasionally be persecuted by it for refusing to worship it. Well, that began to come to an end with Emperor Constantine. And that process, I suppose you would say, it made its climax with Emperor Theodosius the Great and the Edict of Thessalonica, wherein baptism became not just entry into the church, but Roman citizenship as well. Now, this process, in 302, Armenia becomes Catholic. In the following decade, Georgia, not the real one in southwestern United States, but the phony one on the Black Sea, Georgia, Ethiopia, they all became entirely Christian nations, from king to prince. But again, the big climax was the empire turning that way. So now you've got a situation where the body politic, the Respublica Christiana, has two facets that are distinct, and yet partly joined. They are the church and the state. I'd say that the church is the form and the matter, the body, the matter of the body politic of the Respublica Christiana. Now, what does this mean, practically speaking? Well, it meant that, of course, the church's goal of leading all men to heaven became the state's goal. But the way in which the state accomplished this was rather different to that of the church. The church did it through the direct application of Christ's merits via the sacraments to the individual. And with that, of course, came a lot of other stuff in terms of teaching and so on and so on. For the state, it meant, on the one hand, physically supporting the church in her mission, but it also meant attempting to create circumstances where people were not so busy worrying either about starvation or being robbed or murdered, that they could focus on their salvation. So it's very difficult to worry about your soul if you're either starving or being beaten to a pulp.
Yeah.
So it kind of pushes your attention in other directions. So that was the thing. Baptism brought you to the body politic, and non-Christians, non-Catholics were basically outside. the body. So you had Jews, Muslims, the heretics of various kinds. If they lived in Christian countries, they lived in their own communities, which were under their own control. They were outside the law, outside Christian law. It's the way it was. Now, that system began to break down with the Protestant revolt, where in those countries that accepted it, the new church, whatever it was, became the state church. And the Catholics became the outsiders, those who remained faithful to what they had held. It also meant that the new state churches lost half the job, you might say, of the church. What they retained was being the presence in every community, the organizing principle of society, etc., etc. What they lost was independence and the ability to be the conscience of the king. Because now the king would decide, not them, not the church, what was true, what was right, and so forth. Well, this went on, of course, over the next several centuries. In Protestant countries, a more or less peaceful secularization took place until, as you have in Scandinavia and Britain today, the established church was simply there to bless whatever those in charge wanted blessed without anything further. In Catholic countries, it was upended by violent revolutions, which have continued almost down to our present day. So, we now live in a time when there are virtually no Christian countries, maybe Liechtenstein, in the traditional sense of the word, no Catholic confessional state exists. And so, in a lot of ways, we are right back where we were before Emperor Constantine. Now, some people in the 60s saw this coming and thought it would be a really good thing. Yeah, that's really pure. Well, it doesn't really work that way in real life. That kind of thing was more of a sort of political Manichaeism than anything else. The spirit is good, and the evil world of politics is just plain evil.
Yeah.
It makes a certain sense, but it's not true, and it doesn't work. The epitome of it was JFK's declaration that he would never let his faith affect his conduct in public life. And apparently, just to make sure it didn't seep over, he wouldn't let it affect his private life either, but that's a whole issue. Now, that having been said, it puts us to where we are. And where we are is under the aegis of a very different kind of faith, one in which infanticide is a sacrament, as is perversion, sodomy, euthanasia. They're all sacramental and sacred to the church that dominates us, to the religion of our masters. So it's in that context that you have people discussing things like integralism, post-liberalism, etc., and getting all bent out of shape at those who believe in the social kingship of Christ. I've heard some people go so far as to say, oh, you'd impose a Catholic Sharia. Well, see, we already live under whatever this is, a woke Sharia. So we already have it. Live it, deal, eat it.
Yeah.
We already have it. So it's not a question of whether we're going to have it. We have it. Yeah. Now then, what you might ask, well, what's to be done? I would say, firstly, bear in mind that the social kingship of Christ was not something that people sat down and planned. It was the natural result of evangelizing society and of the pre-Christian institutions becoming Christianized. And the more that happened, the more people like St. Augustine and St. Gelasius, and a whole bunch of others, began to see how the institutions of pagandom could be rescued and aimed at their proper goal. So the first thing I would say is that without evangelization, without conversion, we have what we have.
Yeah.
And that's just it.
Yeah.
There's no political solution in the sense of elections because we have two candidates who assure us they're equally pro-abortion. I can only say, okay, great, fine. Glad you're enjoying baby killing. But please don't complain of a lack of taxpayers or a lack of bodies to be wasted in your wars. Please don't complain about that.
Yeah.
Just enjoy what you've wrought.
Yeah. And I guess right there's a lot built into what you said, and it touches on a variety of different related topics. But I guess one thing that you kind of seems to approximate and even explicitly say at a lot of points was that the concept, I mean, politics is rooted in this notion that the entire telos of the system, of the government, of political leaders is to bring about justice. And so justice is a fundamentally moral claim. And so basically the Christian political view, and by extension the social kingship of Christ, is basically rooted in this notion of you can't have a proper view on justice without understanding the nature of the human person, the purpose of human life. And so there comes a point when the state has to recognize the eternal heavenly destiny of human and origin of human life. And basically the church and the state are just dealing with two different aspects of that broader process by which the person is brought to heaven. And that's what creates authentic justice. Or
it doesn't have to. No. Heavens to Betsy, no. It can keep on going the way it's going and reap the reward.
Yeah.
Which will be a lot of dead people.
Yeah.
I mean, history is filled with regimes and societies that refused to accept truth. And they paid a price for it. But at least they got to keep their own ideas pure.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole notion of the common good, for instance, without which you can't really have any kind of governance. Though that phrase does not mean the same thing for the Christian as to the whatever we are. For the Christian, it goes back to everyone living just lives, the purpose in this world, trying to lead just lives in this world for the sake of eternity. But for us, as what we are now, us moderns, well, the common good is the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number, the most pigs in the trough. That's our idea of the common good.
And there, all you have to do is satisfy people's material needs, and who cares about creating a context within which their spiritual and moral needs can flourish? You know?
Spiritual and moral are phrases that don't even exist. I mean, look, when you hear someone, one of my favorite phrases, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Okay, what I'm saying is, I want some sort of a connection with a greater reality beyond me, without any kind of responsibility for having to do anything.
Yeah.
Or to conform to anything other than what I want to do. Or to put this another way, I'm looking for a God who will tell me that everything I'm doing wrong is right.
Yeah.
And I only know of one spiritual being who makes that promise.
And he has horns and a pitchfork, so
Yeah. He's not the nicest of people. You know, one of the things that always gets me about the devil is that the two-faced way that he deals with us, and we never seem to catch on. He starts out as the tempter. Go ahead, do it. You know you owe it to yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Then you do it, and suddenly he's the accuser.
Yeah.
Look what he did. Do you see God? Do you see what he did?
Yeah.
No, I don't think he's a very nice individual. Kind of a two-faced liar, but he was a liar from the beginning.
Exactly. And so one thing that I think really sticks out to me is how the term justice, if you look at the etymology of that word, literally means right order, right? And so the right order can exist in the individual soul and then in terms of our external actions. And then part of external actions is our relationship with others. So you can't claim to have a just or rightly ordered internal state and yet have your external actions be based on moral principles that are diametrically opposed to that. It just can't work. It's moral schizophrenia.
Yeah, I mean, my late father used to say that every one of us every day has to struggle to make his belief fit his behavior or his behavior fit his belief. And I think that's very true.
Yeah.
We are faced with, I mean, there's a sense in which you can live in the social kingship of Christ in the here and now.
Yeah.
Everyone has the right to practice as much goodness as they would like in their own lives. That we do have, and no one can stop us. No pope, no priest, no president, no prime minister can stop you from being as virtuous as you could possibly be.
Yeah.
That's so we can form cells in that kingship. Now, in terms of affecting the larger political landscape, I go back to what I said earlier. The kingship of Christ didn't come about overnight. It came about in one of two ways. Either a ruling class converts and says, all right, we're going to do it this way from now on. Or, and then it seeps down, or a large number of people in a given society convert, and through their numbers, they force it to change. But those are the two ways it's always worked. I've always thought it interesting that when Christianity first came to Rome, the first converts were at the opposite ends of the social spectrum. They were among the slaves and amongst the old pre-imperial Roman nobility, the most noble of the Romans.
Yeah.
And you look at that, you say, well, gee, and there they were side by side at the Mass every Sunday in the catacombs. So you ask, well, gee, that's kind of weird. Where'd that come from? Well, where it came from was the faith in very different ways gave meaning to those two classes' lives. In the case of the slaves, it meant that they were real human beings, equal to anyone else, and that their lives and their sufferings and their difficulties had real meaning. To the Roman nobility, who for centuries had tried to maintain the Roman virtues without any real reason for doing so, it supernaturalized them. And it gave those virtues a meaning far in excess of what they had been. It justified their long watch, in other words. So I would say that the same thing is going to have to happen again. You know, the great thing about the Catholic faith, the great thing about the truth, is that every person alive has a different reason for being drawn to it. For some, it's the liturgy. For some, it's the music and the art that she's acquired over the ages. For other people, it's the sheer logic of her dogmas. For other people, it's, believe it or not, for want of a better word, folk customs.
Yeah.
For other people, it's the liturgy itself. And so it goes. I mean, you could probably come up with as many reasons for people to come in as there are people.
Yeah.
uh, which is all to the good, obviously, because it's intended for everyone. But we really have to begin to think in terms of the long term. Uh, if you're one of these folk who gets bent out of shape by the notion of the Catholic social state as being, Catholic Sharia, don't worry about it. Ain't gonna happen in your lifetime anyway. And if it ever does happen, it will happen with the desire of the vast majority of people in a given place. It won't be imposed because it can't be. And yet, look at what has been imposed.
Yeah.
That we
And
all accept, really, because what's the alternative?
yeah.
I mean, both Mr. Trump and Mrs. Harris are totally dedicated to gay marriage. So who are we to say they're wrong?
Yeah.
Are they not the brightest and the best?
I mean, that's dubious, but yeah.
Well, I'd never heard such treason. Boy, you're lucky I'm on my off day, or I'd call my control and have them pick you up.
Well, I mean, the older I get, the more I end up, when I was young, the terms conservative and liberal had an ambiguous meaning that I tried to discern just based on the context of how it was used. Then something happens, you go to college, you read some books on classical political philosophy, you then begin to see, well, conservative historically meant this and liberal historically meant that. And then you look at the way in which American politics is going, and never before in American history do you see both sides supporting a very non-traditional view of marriage. Not only have you never seen both sides of a political debate basically both being pro-choice, just to various degrees. And so the older I get, the more I begin to believe, kind of go back to what I used to think when I was, let's just say, a child or a teenager, of thinking conservative and liberal don't really mean anything. It's just how you use it based on a context, right? It
Pretty
means
much.
nothing.
Not in terms, no, it doesn't. I mean, but we're supposed to get excited and commit ourselves to one of the two sides, and then treat everyone who isn't on our side inhumanly.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how if you put yourself out of it, you'll see the fury in the rhetoric mirrored on the other side.
Yeah.
They're hateful. Okay, well, doubtless they are. But how do we differ with them? Trying to defeat your enemy by becoming worse than he is never a good plan.
Yeah.
And
I feel like, what were you say?
I was just going to say, I don't want to get too down and deep, dirty and cheap, but
yeah,
hearing Mr. Trump committing himself to reproductive rights, I know those words. I've heard them my whole life. I don't need to hear them from the mouth of a so-called Republican.
Yeah. And I feel that, I feel like, and again, not to get too deep down this rabbit hole, but I feel like a lot of what we've just been describing, I think, is seen particularly among conservatives, because I think the sorts of people who support Harris and Biden and, the other liberal candidates are, I think, the exact sort of people that you'd expect to support a more liberal candidate. Whereas when you look at, people who support Trump, they tend to fall into two camps. People who are, I think, conservatives in principle, who are voting for Trump because they view him as like the most likely candidate for the Republicans, or the most likely to win. And then I think there's a lot of people who we normally wouldn't consider, conservatives or traditionalists or whatever, and they're voting for Trump because they're just disillusioned with the way things are, or, they like how he's, will bust people's chops, and how he's basically a living meme, and but he's not. They're not conservative or traditional in principle. You
Yeah.
know.
Well, principle, of course, is what's entirely lacking there.
Yeah.
And yet, part of me says perhaps this is what we have to have. Perhaps we require the reduction of absurdum.
Yeah.
Uh, maybe without President Harris, we'd never pick up. Maybe we need to have our tax base destroyed.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the only thing that'll make us wake up. I
Yeah.
hope not.
But I feel that, that actually touches on an important point that sort of, I think, is the great transition in our discussion, that ideas have consequences. And, as much as people, and again, I don't necessarily consider myself, I mean, I consider myself as holding what could be considered more conservative opinions. I hate considering myself in the camp of American conservatism because I'm informed by my Catholicism first and foremost. But there's a phrase that American conservatives will use, and I think people hate this phrase, but I think this is one of the phrases that, occasionally one of the parties will put out that happens to be true, that, you know, politics is downstream from culture. But I would say, well, take another step further. Culture is downstream from morality, and morality is downstream from religion
Yeah.
or from metaphysics, the transcendent, whatever, spirituality. But I would venture to say that I think all the great saints of history recognize this fact. And they didn't, like you said, there was no board meeting of popes and theologians to say, okay, what does society look like when we accept the social kingship of Christ? But there was this notion of we have a duty to save souls, and as we save souls, society becomes more Christian.
Yeah.
And I guess this is sort of like the defining element of um, when the rubber hits the road, is obviously, you know, we live in today's world. It's just a fact that we happen to live in religiously diverse and pluralistic societies. We also, even if that wasn't the case, even within the more traditional view, the church is against the notion of forced conversions, but we still have a duty to conform society to Christian values if we believe that Christian values are true and touch on the sort of basis, the most basic questions of human life, and
Yeah.
are true in how they evaluate those questions. So this leads to the question of what does the social kingship of Christ look like, or how do we further it, so to speak, in this sort of pluralistic world that we live in, you know?
Well, as I say, you start with the individual. That's the first thing. Secondly, uh, it's not just a question of practicing the faith, it's making it visible. So, if you belong to a parish or a Catholic religious grouping that have a lot of processions, and, consecrations of your town, your county, your state, the country, that kind of thing. In other words, anything that makes the faith more public, get it out there. Evangelize, 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 evangelize. Bring as many people you can to the faith, because in all likelihood, there's no one else around who'll do it. If you don't do it, no one will.
Yeah.
And there are ways you can do this that are less difficult than you might think. So, for instance, your kid has a confirmation party. That was to be confirmed. Throw a confirmation party and invite all your non-Catholic friends and co-workers.
Yeah.
You'd have to explain confirmation to them.
Yeah.
But in the context of a celebration.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good place to start. Be to the degree that you can in your workplace or wherever, putting up Catholic worker symbols is a very, very important thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you can do this. They can't stop you.
Yeah.
So I would start with that.
Yeah. And I guess
no non-religious Christmas cards.
Well, I mean, and I think, we got to put the Christ back in Christmas somehow. So, you know, but I guess
Sure.
this leads to the something that I was thinking of as you were saying all that is I think part of the reason why the relationship between the social kingship of Christ and the reality of religious pluralism seems like such an ambiguous, slippery, squishy sort of question to deal with in today's world, where it wouldn't have been, let's just say, 100 or 80 years ago when Pope Pius XI was establishing this feast day, or back in the medieval or the early modern era, is because people back then didn't necessarily see religion as a purely personal thing. It is a personal thing because it's about your relationship to God and then what God has done to you and your responsibilities to God. But it also is a communal thing. So, would you believe that the loss of that is part of what makes this such a uh, difficult question for
Well,
people who are dealing with these two realities? Or
well, yeah, because even as late as my boyhood, uh, there was sufficient connections left to the prior state of affairs. I mean, in public schools, you had Christmas pageants.
yeah,
You had prayer in schools. And ironically, we Catholics tended to oppose the kinds of prayers they had in school because they were all Protestant.
yeah,
But we didn't oppose the idea of prayer in school.
yeah,
Uh, and of course, everywhere reflected the religious life. You have in movie theaters, you always have at Christmas time an announcement. Uh, the manager and staff of this theater wish you a very Merry Christmas and a very happy 1956.
yeah,
Uh, you just it was something you just had a connection to. All of that is gone. So
yeah,
you have to make a very conscious effort to be, as it were, countercultural.
yeah. And I feel like part of it has to do with there's a loss of a sense of community as well. So when there's no community, or when the only sense of community you get is in the four walls of wherever you worship, I think it's easy to see it as a personal thing,
Uh, yeah, it
and
is.
nothing more.
And you got to try not to.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's also the point, because like, and again, that was I think a good point that you raised earlier, is that when religion is seen as integral to the community, it's really a matter of which religious values do you want to support,
Yeah,
and not a matter of whether or not religion plays a role.
precisely, because religion will always play a role. It's
Yeah,
just, is it a religion you can live with?
yeah, yeah. And I think that right there is the point, because everyone's gonna have guiding principles, and no one and it's a matter of which principles you want guiding your life. And I think we need to remember something that you had said earlier, because I think you had brought up the example of how people were willing to be very explicit in in presenting their religion in public, and everyone thinks, well, let's just go back to that, and so let's just like nail the Ten Commandments to the front of you know the school, the classroom, and then that's going to end there. And I think when you begin to form these personal connections, people will begin to see the light of Christ shining through you. And it's only when that happens enough times that you will begin to see enough people coming into Christianity that society will be conformed. Like, I had a professor when I was in grad school who was Jewish. She was raised, she came from a mixed marriage, but one of her parents was Jewish, and that was the path she went down. And part of what brought her into Catholicism, well, first Christianity more generally, and then Catholicism, was she was stationed in a Catholic nation when she was in the Peace Corps was so overtaken by their moral example, by their sense of joy and generosity, and said, "Well, wait a second, these people all go to church all the time. This can't be that parallel can't be a coincidence."
No.
And then that set off a chain of events that led her into Catholicism. You know?
Well, yeah. I mean, as I say, it's always the way because there are an infinite number of ways whereby God attracts us into the faith, and it, as our Creator, He knows what each of us are like and what will appeal to each of us.
Yeah.
But the other thing I should mention is that you can't evangelize what you don't love, and you can't love what you don't know, which means that for the Catholic, it's incumbent on him, one, to study the faith so he can share it, but also to study the area he finds himself in, get to know it very, very well.
Yeah.
And see what you can do towards spreading the faith in it.
Yeah. I mean, wherever you find yourself, whatever circles you find yourself walking in, I think you need to learn to reach the people who are there, if most of them are not Catholic.
Yeah.
And I've had coworkers in jobs before who were pretty much looked like the opposite of us, and they were non-Catholic, and they looked it, and for weeks or months would go by before I would discuss anything with religion, and I befriended these people. And now it got to the point where something came up and we started to talk about religion, and they were actually interested in hearing what I said. Then after, a couple of months, I remember one coworker who, actually was like, "So, what are your thoughts on abortion and gay marriage?" And I told them what my views are, and she went, "Shit," because she felt like she was already kind of friends with me, but she couldn't because her side of the aisle said you can't be friends with people like us, right? But because I had formed somewhat of a friendship, she was a little bit more receptive to hearing what I had to say,
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's certainly. I mean, you never ever lose by being decent to people.
Yeah.
Even if you don't agree with them.
Exactly. And I feel like that's the problem in today's world is people have pitted the notion of kindness against truth.
Which in reality the two are closely connected.
Yeah. But I mean, I think in today's world, what we see more than anything is political correctness, which is niceness disconnected from truth, or we see fanaticism, which is truth disconnected from kindness.
Yeah.
So, but to sort of end our discussion, what would you say is like the big thing, the main thing that you would like people to keep in mind when trying to, serve as a vessel for the establishment of the social kingship of Christ? Because in our last discussion, again, as I said at the beginning of our interview, we talked about this topic in its more general form. Now that we've kind of spoken a little bit more about the cultural and historical and evangelistic elements of it, what would you say is the biggest thing you would like the average Catholic to keep in mind, moving forward?
Your home is your fortress. So you should fill it up with Catholic books. You should have a home altar, statues, icons, a St. Benedict's medal to protect you. In other words, carry yourself at once as both a defender and an emissary of the great kingdom. And do that, be true to that glorious quest, in the immortal words of Don Quixote, and you will attract other people to you, I promise.
That no truer words have been said. Well, thank you so much, Charles, for joining me again in this interview. It was great to speak with you, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
This is Cal. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and God bless.
You too.